We're going to talk about mastery-based learning, just so that you have an understanding of what it is and why we do some of the things that we do with ACE. And this works better if I turn it on. Okay. All right, so what is mastery learning? The mastery learning breaks a subject into small units of work, and we work sequentially, provide feedback on the student's learning, and have self-assessment and a corrective activity, and then a formative assessment. Now, if you look at this, you've actually pretty well described the ACE PACE process. This is actually what mastery-based learning theory is, okay? So we break the subject into small units of work. So we break them into what we call PACEs, but within the PACE, they're actually broken up into sections. As you can see from the PACEs that you've been doing, they're broken into sections, and then you have a checkup at the end of that section within the PACE. Works sequentially, that's actually one of the real strengths of ACE, is the sequential progress through concepts and content, so that we have a firm foundation for further growth and further knowledge. Provide feedback on a student's learning. Now, this is something that a lot of educational specialists and conventional classroom teachers don't really understand with ACE. They look at the PACEs and they go, well, they're just working in the workbook and answering the questions themselves. Where is the feedback? Where's the feedback on their learning? But the feedback on their learning is right throughout everything we do. When they get up to score, they have feedback on their learning straight away. Is it right? Is it wrong? So that is one form of feedback. They also have feedback whenever they put their supervisor's flag up. Can I go on? Am I allowed to do the next bit? Have I learned enough? Or the supervisor, if they haven't progressed to that point and they're not ready to do the next step, the supervisor will actually intervene then with one-on-one tutoring, quizzing, whatever. So that's a feedback on the student's learning. They also get official feedback at the end of the PACE when they pass the test. So there's continual feedback to the student using the ACE procedures. Self-assessment. Well, we don't call it self-assessment. What do we call it? It's at the end of every PACE. Self-test. Yeah. Yeah, everybody always thinks that's a trick question. We call it a self-test. So I am testing myself. Am I ready? Do I know enough to be able to pass this test? So the self-test actually should give you confidence. It's really interesting during staff training. As adults, we learn quite differently to children, and we have far more room for self-doubt than children do. So often, in staff training, people will hand in the self-test and they will have got 98 or 100% and go, I don't know if I'm ready to do this test. Well, you just got 100% in the self-test. Of course you're ready to do the test. If you've done the self-test properly without looking back in the PACE, it is a fairly accurate measure of what you've learned in the PACE. So it should really give you confidence to do the PACE test if you pass it well. And the same with your students. That should be the thing that they measure before they do the PACE test. The student actually should be able to go to the supervisor and say, I only just got 80% on my self-test. I don't feel I'm ready to do this PACE test. That's where they should get to. Or they should go to the supervisor and go, woohoo, I got 100%, I'm good to go. I'm gonna just, fly through this PACE test. It should actually be building their confidence. And that's something that you need to teach the students in your learning centre, that the self-test isn't it's a test at the end and it's, it's not. It's there to say, am I ready? Do I know enough? Can I go ahead with confidence knowing that I'm going to pass this PACE test? So it's a great thing. Corrective activity, what do we call it? Rescoring. Simple. We correct anything that we've done wrong. We don't leave our errors there. We go back and make sure that they're done. A corrective activity can be when the supervisor is quizzing the student. There has been an issue with the learning. Let's correct that issue. Let's make sure that they're on the right track and we've got the right things happening. And then we have the formative assessment at the end of the PACE. So that's basically what mastery learning is and how it fits into the ACE system. Now, another part of mastery learning is what is called pre-assessment. We call it diagnostic testing. What does the student already know? That's what we want to establish. What prior knowledge does the student have? What does the student need to learn? And that's what's shown up when we do the diagnostic testing. It shows us, firstly, what the student knows, secondly, what the student needs to know to make progress. The next part, missing prerequisite concepts. I love all this education speak. Simply means what gaps are there in their learning. I just love missing prerequisite concepts. What on earth does that mean? So it's basically the learning gaps. What pieces of information is the student missing that they need to know to be able to make good progress in their learning? So that's basically all of that is. So you can see that ACE is actually built on mastery learning concepts. The next thing that for mastery learning that mastery learning requires is instruction and assessment. Initial instruction. When you have a student conference, we have a student conference when the student finishes a PACE, they've done their PACE test, and I'll just grab a PACE. Thank you, Jono. My arms aren't long enough. Okay, they've finished the PACE. Now, what we did yesterday was when you'd finished the PACE, we handed out the congratulations slips. You got your star. You got your old PACE back because you take that off because that goes then in your professional learning and you can refer back to it at any time. But what happens with the student is the student finishes their PACE test. The next day, the teacher marks it after school, the next day. And the next day, the student should have a student conference, what ACE calls a conference, unless they've changed the terminology. And that is when we go through the My Goals page of the next PACE. So you're talking to the student about you passed your test, you had a number of things wrong in your test. These were what you got wrong so that they know what they got wrong. And this is where we're going next. So we're talking about what is happening in the PACE. So this is the initial instruction and this should happen with every single PACE that the child gets. There would be an individual one-on-one time with the supervisor going through what is in this next unit of work. Don't just give the student the PACE, you need to be going through it. So the first section of the PACE is that initial instruction part. A checkup or unit test to reinforce and recall learning, to measure comprehension and mastery, and the student evaluates their own understanding, and if there's anything wrong, we then have a corrective activity. So your checkup is like your mini test inside the PACE. And that's the place where you actually should stop a student from failing a test. I always say tests are passed or failed at the checkup, because that's when the supervisor should be looking at what the student has done, Has learning taken place? Are they ready to do the checkup? You should be looking at the checkup after the student has done it. A lot of schools require well, everybody should require an initial before they start the checkup, but a lot of schools actually require that the student put their flag up after a checkup. One of the things that I used to do, it's not actually part of ACE procedures, but I sort of call this ACE Plus. One of the things my monitor, when the student came back after a checkup, they had to put their monitor's flag up, and my monitor would look. If they passed, they were allowed to continue on. If they didn't pass, they had to put their supervisor's flag up. Or if they got a lot of things wrong in their checkup, they had to put the supervisor's flag up, because that's where you actually stop children from failing tests. Not at the self-test, but at the checkup. So the checkup is your early warning system. Okay, so, and this goes on throughout the PACE. So you've got the first section of the PACE checkup, second section of the PACE checkup. So ACE actually has done this extremely well, so that it's quite rigid in some ways, but within that structure, it allows you to have control over what is happening and to always know whether the student is learning. Now here's another one. We need to have parallel formative assessments. So we have the self-test, where the students demonstrate what they've learned, and the student also demonstrates what they still need to learn, if anything. Obviously, if they get 100%, then they have really learned pretty well everything that can be done in that PACE. We then have a corrective activity, rescoring if needed, and then we retest them at the PACE test level, and that is the final test for that unit of work. So the student should there demonstrate mastery of the concepts that are in that PACE. How do they fail? All right. Now, many of our schools have constant and consistent failure of PACEs, failure of PACE tests. So that's another thing that we need to really address. How do students fail? Number one reason, incorrect diagnosis at the start, particularly if they're a new student coming into your school. They haven't been with you through the ABCs and all the way through their schooling. They've come into the school from another system, and they are either not diagnosed or they're incorrectly diagnosed. If you are not sure about how to diagnose your students, let me know. Talk to your PC, your pastoral coordinator. If they're not sure how to do it, then they'll send them on to me, and we can work something out, and we'll help you to diagnose your students. Often we find students are working beyond the level of their ability. So they're working in PACEs that have concepts and activities that they do not have the foundational learning to be able to complete. So that causes a lot of problems, and that is one of the major reasons that children fail PACE tests. This is the next one. Not passing checkups. In other words, they get below 80% on their checkup and they're just allowed to continue on. So you need to be really, really vigilant about checkups. Checkups are the most important part of the PACE, and you're going to hear me say it over and over and over again, because they're a tool in the PACE that is not used well. If you really want to be 100% sure that your students are going to pass, then they need to be getting 90% on their checkups, because there is still that little room for failure if they're only getting 80%. I believe the manual says that they should be getting 90% on checkups and self-tests. It used to be 80%, but 90% just is that extra little bit that means that they're actually going to pass. One of the main reasons that students fail tests, and this is probably the second biggest reason after incorrect diagnosis, the second biggest reason is looking back for answers. In other words, they're not learning, they're not taking from what they've learned and doing the checkup. They're just going back and finding that part and filling in the answer. So it doesn't become a test of what they know. It is actually just a continuation of their work. The checkup should be a test of what they know. It's a checkup, it's what it says. I'm checking up that you know what we've learned so far. So if you don't use it as that, then you're setting the children up for failure. And this is what is happening in a lot of our schools as we speak. So looking back for answers is one of the main reasons. You can have a child that will get 100% on every checkup, 100% on their self-test. And as a supervisor, you would be looking at that and going, fine, they're ready to do their test. And then they get 35% on their PACE test. That's a clear indication that they're not working from what they've learned, they're just looking back at the answers. I have a friend in my learning centre, a very valuable friend. It's called my stapler. If you think that children are looking back, then you can very easily just staple the pages before the checkup. So this is the checkup. These pages here, staple here, staple here. It makes it very difficult for the child to look back. It makes it very obvious if they're looking back. If you don't have a stapler, move the child out of their office to do the self-test. Sit them at a table where you have a clear view of what they're doing at the self-test, and you can see if they're looking back. So they're two methods that actually work very well. But looking back at checkups is one of the main reasons that children fail PACEs. And even in staff training, I say this in staff training, and I still have people in staff training who, when they get to the checkup, they look back at the answers, they get 100% on their checkup, 100% on their self-test, fail the PACE test. And then they get into trouble from me because I know exactly what they've done. They've looked back for the answers. If there's lots of red crosses through the PACE, that needs to be addressed at the checkup again. That shouldn't be left until they get to the self-test. The checkup is there, it's for the student to check up what they've learned, but it's for the supervisor to check up on the progress that the student is making. Has learning taken place? That's the question that you always want to be asking in the Learning Centre. How do I know that learning has actually taken place? I know when the student can tell me about what they've been learning with some accuracy. Constant rescoring, not understanding concepts, and students that won't put their flag up to ask for help, or supervisors who are not equipped to give the students help. So we need to make sure that when a student needs help, that we have the resources to be able to help that student. And we need to make sure that when a child is constantly rescoring, that they're not just left to keep going on and on and on, but the monitor's picking it up, letting the supervisor know that this child needs help. Getting answers from score keys. That's another reason that children fail PACEs, because they get the answers from the score keys. Now, I was asked this question this training, I'm asked this question every training. What's to stop the child when they're scoring their work, what's to stop them from looking at the next few answers on the score key, going back and just writing them in? The answer is absolutely nothing. You can't stop that. What you can do is say to the student, it doesn't help you to do it that way. But it's like anything. You cannot force a child to learn. You can force them to do lots of things, but you can't force them to learn. They have to have, something has to come from them for them to actually learn. And it's the same with when we're training character. You can't force a child to have good character. It's something that they develop and they learn. So, but that there has to be something spontaneous from them. You need to watch the time that they're at the scoring station. You need to be aware of that. And the thing that happens is that if they continue to do that, then they will come undone, either at the checkup, the self-test, or usually at the PACE test. They will come undone at some point and they will fail a PACE. How do they fail? Not passing the self-test with 90%. They really need to get 90% on those self-tests to ensure that they have enough solid knowledge to pass the PACE test. Looking back for answers, scoring violations, all of these things. The Bible tells us about the man who built the house on the rock and the man that built the house on the sand. If we have our children with a firm foundation, they're like the man who built his house on the rock. They have a strong foundation, so when things get harder and tougher and life happens, they have that firm foundation and they're not going to fall. But what happened to the man who built his house on the sand? Fell down. And that's what happens when we don't have those firm foundations, where we don't have those gaps filled, when we don't have those strong learning centre procedures, and when we don't have diligent supervisors in the learning centre, and also diligent monitors in the learning centre. So it's a huge responsibility that we have in a learning centre as supervisors and monitors, to make sure that what we are doing is helping these young people to have firm foundations that they can build on, so that they not only have a good education, but they also have a good, strong character, and they have spiritual growth. So we want to see those three things happening in the learning centre, and they only happen when you, as the supervisor and monitor, create that situation for them. So a lot of it depends on what you do in the learning centre and the procedures and the expectations that you have of those children. If you want to have a successful learning centre where you have students that pass every test, then you have to create that situation. The results of mastery learning are a building of knowledge and understanding in logical steps. The students master each concept. They don't just brush through the concept, they actually master the learning, and we know that they're ready to progress. And there's good retention of mastered concepts. I often think of the girls from the 24/7 squad that were all graduates that could remember the phonics sounds. And those things, they're things that we've actually mastered when we still remember. And we need to have an environment of success. If you have a learning centre where you have continual failure of PACE tests, then you are actually creating an environment of failure. You need to turn that round and create an environment of success. So mastery learning is an educational concept that ACE is founded on. It is strong, it has a firm foundation, and it's something that not only do we need to understand, we need to understand it so that we put it into practice. I often think that people don't put things into practice because they don't understand the why we do them. So this is why we do what we do as far as the procedures go, so that we have mastery learning in our learning centres and we do create that environment of success. Thank you.